You're listed here, so David Sweanor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm an adjunct professor of law at the University of Ottawa. I'm also chair of the advisory board for the Centre for Health Law Policy and Ethics at the University of Ottawa. But I think the reason I was invited to testify is that I've worked as a lawyer on policy measures to reduce cigarette smoking since 1983. Played a key role in anti-smoking policies, and I'll immediately contradict what Dr. Gallant was saying. Smoking didn't fall because of something that was done by kids talking to their parents. Like so many other things, it's policy. It was government. It was measures that made a difference. It's changing rules, changing the economics, doing things to give people better information, doing things to give people better options makes a real difference. My interests go well beyond issues of smoking and health, though. I work on a lot of different areas of public health. I work on them. I mentor people. I fund these things. Among other things, I was honored with an award as Ottawa's Outstanding Individual Philanthropist in 2016 because of a lot of the interests I have in these things, having come to terms with the idea that my life expectancy is not long enough to handle all the issues I'm personally interested in. I have to find other people working on them. I think the goal that we need to keep in mind is that we should be trying to rationally, pragmatically work to do things that essentially make the world a better place. That's the principles of the Enlightenment. How do we use science? How do we have rational debate? How do we move ahead on some of the areas where we can have huge advances for society at very little cost, very little effort, if we're willing to show some vision. Have that rationality, show that pragmatism. Cigarette smoking has been a prime example of that. We have had major advances. We still lack the sort of vision necessary to do much more, which we could. It's still killing 20,000 people a day globally. And they're dying not just because they're inhaling smoke as a really deadly delivery system for getting a drug into their bodies, which is relevant to C-45, but because of a lack of vision by governments, not doing the sorts of things that would be necessary to change that delivery system, to do something so that people don't have to die because they're using a drug. With Bill C-45, one of the fundamental concerns I have with the legislation is that it's still treating drug use as a crime, not a public health issue. And this is decades past the Ledane Commission of 1972 that I think had a very sensible approach, or the Senate Special Committee on Illegal Drugs in 2002 that also talked about, to quote, governments must promote autonomy as far as possible and therefore only make sparing use of the instruments of constraint. Criminal law is just a really bad way to deal with public health issues. A public health approach makes a whole lot of sense. Criminal law has given us approaches to illicit drugs that have not only not worked, they've been a catastrophe, not just in Canada, but more so in our neighbor to the south. And C-45 gives some exemptions, and often in, I think, confusing ways, but still maintains that overall, let's treat it as a crime problem. So it is saying that somebody can have over 30 grams of cannabis, or can have up to 30 grams, sorry, that's really important to remember the distinction. So you and I could each go into a store and buy 25 grams as long as it's a legal store. But if I, on leaving, said, oh, I have to go somewhere else before the party, can you take mine with you? You're potentially looking at 5 years. If I say, oh, the store is closed, but I know a guy over here who sells it, 5 years. If you have 4 plants and I have 4 plants and we decide we're going to move in together and keep our plants, well, we now have more than 4 years, 4 plants in our residence, 5 years in prison, potential treatment. What happens when you have somebody who's just over the age of 18 giving somebody just under the age of 18 some cannabis? Well, that's potentially 14 years. And as much as we can say that these sorts of penalties would not be imposed in Canada, they're only imposed in places like the United States, we know from a long history that laws are imposed in unacceptable ways that treat different people differently, and it causes a lot of confusion with the public. But I think a major problem with the legislation is that it allows cannabis to be smoked, but it doesn't allow people to get the drug in a non-combustible form, which is how an awful lot of people are already accessing it. I think I was invited because I've written articles on this, on issues of cannabis as well as on smoking cigarettes. The smoke's the problem. That's the biggest health risk. That's the dirtiest way to deliver a drug. It's the smoke that's the most dangerous. There's already a market for vaping cannabinoids and for edibles. Health Canada's approved a product, the Volcano, for vaping marijuana. And what I think we end up with, similar to the problems that I see with S5, which I really wanted to testify about but wasn't allowed to, we're protecting the most dangerous delivery systems. We're protecting the smoking. We're missing issues of relative risk, which is a basic issue of moral philosophy, to be able to distinguish between things on relative harms. We're ignoring consumer rights about the rights of people to have a less hazardous delivery system. We are distorting or banning truthful information. S5 does this in spades. It makes it illegal for a company to tell people the difference in risk between their products, even when that difference in risk is enormous. We're banning less hazardous alternatives, such as what we're seeing with C-45. And though we're talking about we will be able to change this later, why are we talking about changing it later? Why are we acting like it's the smoking of cannabis that's okay, it's the vaping that would be a problem? So we're misleading the public, and we're doing things that are in violation of our Charter of Rights. So both pieces of legislation, S5 and C-45, I think could be tossed out fairly easily by a constitutional challenge. I think it's important to recognize it's the smoke. In the case of cigarettes, we could essentially end the epidemic of cigarette-caused disease in short order by application of some rationality, pragmatism, and vision. And in the case of illicit drugs, I think we should take an overall public health approach to all illicit drugs, not a criminal law approach, and that we can greatly reduce the harms of illicit drugs, including cannabis, by focusing on the underlying public health issues. Most of the harm is caused by the laws we've put into place rather than by the drugs themselves. In the case of the drugs themselves, a legal market can allow us to deal with those harms far more effectively, and a rational approach of looking at different delivery systems makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thank you.